Yes, welcome back. Max Keiser is me. This is the Keiser Report. Let's go to Las Vegas and talk with Aaron Crown of ml-implode.com, where there have been 388 implosions since 2006. Aaron, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Hey, Max. Good to be back.
All right, Aaron, in the first half of the show, we covered the story of FHA housing, a bailout, facing a bailout risk after guarantee binge. Tell us about the FHA and its role in facilitating fraud and the transfer of the costs that the fraud is to the taxpayer.
Yeah, Max, the FHA was founded in the depths of the Depression to basically provide support to an ailing housing market. And like so many well-meaning programs, maybe met its initial goals, but stuck around and basically turned into a gigantic venue for private actors to raid the government coffers and indirectly raid the taxpayers. The problem being that ostensibly FHA is self-supporting, has its own insurance fund, essentially a kind of deal like FDIC. The problem being the actuarial assumptions and the underwriting. So the question is, what happened to this thing in the housing boom, and potentially other periods like it, where underwriting standards became shoddy, if not criminal, and these things go into a program like FHA and begin to violate the actuarial assumptions and therefore the solvency of this thing. So people are starting to catch on that there's a big problem with FHA in the wake of the latest housing bubble and the mortgage free-for-all and the housing market crash. And I would certainly agree with that. It's in big trouble, and we're starting to see mainstream reports catching on to this and the potential need for a bailout. There were 2 reports, I believe, just in the last 6 months alone. One was from Wharton and one was from George Washington University. And what these reports found is basically, if you do any sort of legitimate fundamental analysis of what's in FHA's portfolio, it is way worse than their official assumptions and projections of their own solvency, to the tune of 50 billion plus.
Okay, so FHA, it's part of the securitization and financialization of the economy, of the banking sector, which is now the biggest piece of the economy, and it's been going on for decades, and it's about taking the mortgages and reoffering them and slicing them and dicing them and repackaging them, and it becomes this bloated middle of the American and global economy. What supposedly is backed up by assets, and these assets are the houses themselves. The mortgages are just a derivative of the house. The house themselves is supposed to be at the bedrock of this thing, but the house prices seem to be continuing to fall. Now, you're in Las Vegas, which is one of the biggest trouble spots in America. House prices in Las Vegas are doing what now?
Well, they're continuing to decline, and that's the case certainly in the worst bubble spots in the country, and overall we're still seeing home price declines. And you're seeing some of these reports starting to realize you can't pretend like FHA did in its projections that you're going to get home price increases, basically saving them and saving the FHA insurance fund, if you've got the opposite in reality, which is continued declines. So this is obviously reality coming in, the reality train crashing through. Well, let me add one thing to what you just said. So FHA is a little different than most securitized mortgages in that it goes into a special securitization called a Ginnie Mae, which is explicitly government backed. So if you're a mortgage originator and you can manage to get an FHA loan underwritten by FHA, which could be a shoddy loan of some sort, and it passes muster for at least an initial period of up to 2 years, it goes into one of these Ginnie Mae securities and it becomes government backed explicitly. So basically, once you get in the gate with a potentially poorly written, possibly fraudulently underwritten loan into FHA, you're basically home free unless the government gets its act together to come and sue you for organized fraud, which is starting to happen now.
Right. So as you point out, once you get into the gate, or in other words, once you enter the Ponzi scheme. Like a Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, it requires more people to go into what they called feeder funds to feed the Ponzi scheme. FHA, Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mac, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, they're all basically bundled together into this huge Ponzi scheme where the underlying asset is houses, but the house prices continue to go down. And as the economy continues to shrink, and as tax revenues continue to collapse because everyone's continuing to pick up part-time jobs or at least have full-time jobs, then the bailouts continue, but the bailouts are based on more borrowed money, which means that the whole system becomes more unstable. But hey, the top 1% gets richer in providing the arson that is the economy. Now, you are the victim of a SLAPP suit, S-L-A-P-P, as a result of your reporting on a case of mortgage lending fraud related to FHA loans. Tell us about it.
Yeah, this was related to one of the most egregious scams. As I mentioned, there are people who had various ways of fraudulently getting these mortgages underwritten by FHA and backed by the government. And one of the most egregious scams was what is called seller-funded down payment assistance. And these operations, or more than one of them, would arrange to get the meager 3% down payment required by FHA, just so the borrower had some skin in the game. But they'd figure out how to get around that by basically having the seller mark up the home. Typically, it was a home builder trying to move inventory. Have them mark up the price, take the difference, and donate it to a nonprofit set up by these operations, and then use that money to cover the down payment. So essentially, you end up with an inflated home loan backed by the government, homeowner who never brought anything to the table and was probably recruited off the street and didn't know what the heck they were doing, was not really educated as to what was going on, usually deceived as to whether this so-called donation for the down payment was charitable. So in effect, you have a 100% government-backed home loan without the government being aware that this is a situation on a loan-by-loan basis, probably without the borrower being aware, and with the lender, the private lender, the builder or other seller, and the broker and possibly realtor making out like bandits through this transaction. So there were a number of operations that did this. The first was Nehemiah Corporation out of California, and they got pretty big. They started in the early 90s. And then a fellow named Christopher Russell out of Gaithersburg, Maryland, saw what they were doing and thought, hey, you know, this is great. I mean, we can really make out like gangbusters here. And his innovation was to market the scheme aggressively to the sell side, so that basically you could have a builder that's sitting there, has all this inventory they can't move, probably, you know, in late 2006, 2007, and attach one of these down payment schemes to it to basically move the inventory at any price and chuck it as future toxic waste onto the books of FHA. So we wrote about one of these schemes. Russell's latest company was, or operation was called the Grant America program, and this was after an IRS crackdown on the scheme. And so to get around that, he started laundering the money through an Indian tribe so that it would basically be presented as government funds, so it could still squeak in and pass muster. So, you know, of course, it still wasn't legitimate. It was just a dodge. But finally, in 2008, in the housing bill, Congress itself woke up at the behest of HUD and explicitly outlawed these schemes. They basically put a provision in that said you can't launder money to get around the FHA down payment requirement. So they had to shut down. But it wasn't until we wrote about that on our site and said, hey, this is what was going on, quoted government reports in the IRS ruling when they cracked down on it, and said, hey, this is completely ridiculous that this was going on. And it was only at that point that they sued us. So they tried to shut us down and get us to take the article down, basically for bringing visibility to the whole scheme. And now this scheme is starting to be understood as a major problem with FHA. And if you look at the quantity of loans that went through these seller-funded down payment schemes, you get a number like $100 billion or so of these SFDPA-linked loans that are defaulting at rates, I believe it's something around 30%.
Well, let's talk about these SLAPP suits for a second. So speak more broadly in terms of who uses the SLAPP suits. It seems more like fly-by-night sole operators than, let's say, a JP Morgan or a Goldman Sachs trying to silence people.
Yeah, I tend to find this is the third such frivolous libel suit that ML Implode has been hit with. And I tend to find that it's the mid-level companies, like such as predatory mortgage operations, that in most cases have had to shut down, but in some cases continue to try to push these lawsuits to try to save face. But generally, they are vulnerable to their wrongdoing coming out and becoming known, when in the past, in often cases, they've had run-ins with the regulators and have paid their protection fees. You know, they've paid little wrist slap settlements, or they've pushed back on technicalities and lawsuits and things like that, and essentially been allowed to keep trucking. So they don't like it when some snotty-nosed blogger or independent online reporter uncovers that there's actually something much more widespread and organized going on, and the government's not going to run and help such people, because typically the regulators have failed in these cases, and there's going to be generally little sympathy from anyone else, because you get allegations of, oh, it's just someone who's disgruntled or just picking on this upstanding company that's paid its dues. So that's the kind of situation. It's generally a mid-sized financial company against an independent journalist or blogger, someone who basically doesn't have their own in-house legal counsel or legal team that they know they can intimidate them with a lawsuit and possibly just bankrupt them or get them shut down by force.
All right, so now finally, you keep a close eye on the mortgage lenders. What's the next fraudulent practice we should look out for?
The big thing out there is people who are looking for help with loan mods. So there are a lot of scams out there with people purporting to do forensic analysis or get your loan modified. So you have to be careful about that. Generally, you want to get a lawyer on your side when you're facing foreclosure and looking to get a loan mod. So that's the hot area for fraud basically right now.
All right, well, maybe it'll be offered as a closed-end trust or an ETF on the New York Stock Exchange. A new way for people to buy into fraud, that is America.com. All right, Aaron Crone, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Aaron Crone from ml-implode.com. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.